Now, have you ever been asked to do something which, from your vantage point, seemed pointless because you weren't told the bigger picture? You weren't told how it fit into the grander scheme of things? Well, chances are you didn't give it your best, and maybe you even became discouraged and gave up. And that's just like the Christian life, isn't it? If we don't know how we fit into God's big plan, His bigger picture, then we can easily become discouraged in our day-to-day struggle against sin and want to give up. And perhaps for some of you watching this video right now, that's how you feel. Well, be encouraged, because we're going to be looking at Paul's letter to the Ephesians. In this short video, we're going to zoom out and take a bird's eye view of how you fit into God's big plan. Now, one reason why Paul wrote his letter to the Ephesians was to let them know how they fit into God's big plan of salvation. That the gospel was for every nation, tribe, and tongue. It's for anyone who truly repents and believes. And this wasn't some afterthought of God. God had planned that before the beginning of time. Now, perhaps you may be inclined to think that on that point, Paul was being a Captain Obvious. Of course, the gospel is for everyone, right? Well, here's the thing. The Ephesians were Gentiles, or non-Jews. And believe it or not, for several years after Christ's resurrection, the early church basically only preached the gospel to Jews. It's not until we get to Acts chapter 10 where we see Peter stepping out and preaching the gospel to the Gentiles after a vision he received from God. It was a seismic shift in thinking for the early church. Unfortunately, the transition wasn't quite so smooth. While many Jewish believers accepted that, yes, okay, salvation is also for the Gentiles, many tended to treat the new Gentile converts as inferiors, as second-class citizens in God's kingdom, as afterthoughts, as latecomers to the show. But Paul wrote to the Ephesians and said, no, you're not inferior. You're not second-class citizens. God didn't just suddenly decide one day, I should include the Gentiles into my plan of salvation. No, Paul said, God had that planned before the beginning of time, and that in the next life, that very thing would actually become a marvel, a wonder throughout all eternity. And quickly, another main point of Paul was that he wanted the Ephesians to know that their struggle wasn't against flesh and blood. It wasn't amongst themselves, it wasn't against fellow human beings, but rather against unseen spiritual forces who were arrayed against the things of God, who were trying to thwart God's big plan. Paul hints that we are part of a much larger unseen drama, comprised of spiritual beings far more powerful than we are, and yet it is we mortals whom God has chosen to elevate along with Christ to be with Him throughout all eternity. Elsewhere, Paul writes that at the end of the age, we mortals will in fact judge those wayward spiritual beings. Now, I know in our day-to-day struggle against sin, it can be discouraging, it can seem at times rather pointless. But remember, you are part of a much larger picture. You are part of God's big plan. And yes, God chose you. He chose you to be a part of it before the beginning of time.